Hi there, my name is Martin Donahoe, and this is my presentation for Adolescent Development, FHS 1230. So I decided to do my presentation on a little bit of background on child labor laws and their relevance, especially during their inception and then now in kind of our market economy. Currently, of the kind of jobs and the necessity of working, especially at that age during the formative growth years. Um, and then how that kind of relates back to the history of child labor laws, and then I guess the benefit of working at such an age versus trying to focus just on school. Um, so some history with child labor laws. You in the first 100 or so years of before the Industrial Revolution, then after, the jobs available to children were mostly to exploit them. A lot of agricultural, sweatshop, factory work, especially in the urban areas. And while it was sufficient for the growth of our country, it was definitely harmful to children's health and very uh, malignant to their growth. And then schooling was also not much of a priority, and it didn't help any of the impoverished families that depended on the child having to work. Um, so in that time, there wasn't too much protection for children. There were certain groups here and there, but nothing that had as much oversight as like a federal law. And then the groups were kind of quite ineffective in reaching all children, especially in the rural and then urban areas where bosses and industry leaders would try to keep out any legislation to help children because they were such cheap labor at the time. So through this project, I wanted to learn more about, I guess, the history and inception and how child labor laws and especially standards of work are either helping or hindering specifically adolescents today, and where that places them in the context of their future and then academically speaking. And as to should adolescents be working, and then is it actually benefiting any employers, and then what kind of jobs? Um, because as it is in our economy, you have to have money and then also work, but also focus on schooling and kind of the binary between that. Um, and then why, and then the history of child labor in general. So, and then I did some interviews with employers at a few places that would hire adolescents, box stores, grocery stores, and then also kind of talked with an adolescent working to kind of see how they sort of feel about working at that age, and especially how the employers see them as working at that age. So, some history of child labor laws. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, um, there wasn't one cohesive group. There was a few private individuals that tried to help children, especially in harmful work environments like factories, where there was a lot of machinery, and where just because children had smaller hands, had to fix things and reach into places, so and then were often harmed. So there wasn't one group, uh, such as like Child Protective Services or any law. There was some legislation, but generally it was quite weak, and it wouldn't actually infringe on any harmful behaviors of the employer. Um, but through the 1900s, there were laws in 28 states somewhat restricting child labor, but still no federal law until 1938 with the passing of the FLSA, Fair Labor and Standards Act, um, which started on the onset of World War II and was generally for women and children and their protection in the workplace because so many of the men's jobs were now vacant. So there weren't there were more jobs available, and then that got people looking at and legislation passed to protect them. So now that today the FLSA is the basic working model of child labor laws and working laws kind of in general, but now it's more about less harmful situations and more restricting machinery use and then hours available to work for the adolescent. And now, so there are a total of about 51 child labor uh, laws in between the 50 states and then the federal FLSA. And in between these two, it's whatever protects the minor most uh, that is taken into effect. And some state laws are stricter than the FLSA, and some are a little bit weaker. So nowadays, the jobs available to adolescents aren't so much sweatshop work and kind of that. The country has about negated child labor laws at this point that would put them in harm or be harmful to themselves, such as there's no children in coal mines anymore. So now it's more about hours and trying to balance school and work. Um, and as nowadays there aren't as many adolescents working, there was a boom in the 90s, but not so much today, where either they don't want to work or they don't have to. Um, and most states restrict any workers under the age of 16, so that's kind of a large age demographic of teenagers that there isn't too much information about their work standards. Usually it's jobs like paper routes, mowing lawns, kind of stuff like very basic stuff like that, not actual employment. Um, so most jobs available to 16-year-olds are in the retail, grocery, and service industries. Um, and in one of these, at a grocery store, I talked to the manager and to kind of get an idea of the context of adolescent employment. And he was basically told me that in the grocery store, at least, they don't usually hire adolescents. They're not sought after because of their restrictive work schedule. They can only work a certain amount of hours each school night, and they can only work so late into the night. And most box stores in the service industry are closed around 10 o'clock, even especially on school nights. And said it was the same when he was managing a Walmart. Did say the exception was when he managed a Chuck E. Cheese, and they actually looked for adolescent workers to fill the void that adults weren't taking those jobs. Speaking with another manager at a Target, I learned that the adolescent shift was about 4 hours on a school day, and that they would have to leave by 9, which then hinders work appropriation because as the store closes at 10 or 11, the adolescent doesn't have to, and that was his gripe with it. So again, adolescents aren't typically sought after for such jobs. And from my personal experience, and then why I find this project important and to learn about child labor laws, is that when I worked in high school, it was very hard to manage school and work. And the pros of maybe learning responsibility in such a kind of a menial job versus managing some little amount of money, because if you can't work as much, you don't have enough money ahead of school and other social extracurricular activities, was more of a hindrance. And eventually I decided that school should just come first and more extracurricular activities. And added to that is the mobility of an adolescent, is that many don't have a car. So then getting from school to work and then to maybe back home or another activity is another stress. So before FLSA, as far as the benefit goes, it was only the employer because they could easily exploit child labor. And now that our country has definitely moved past that system, youth employment seems to only advantage the adolescent if they can manage both. And after taking this course and then also talking with the high school worker, it didn't seem like they cared as much. Not necessarily that they were lazy, but just that there's so much more going on that working is not a huge priority. And especially during one observation I did in high school, there was a freshman class and 2 of them were sleeping. And then that's very hard to see, especially if the teacher isn't understanding and wants them to put school first, but out of necessity they have to. So And then looking at peer relationships to working and then adolescence, there's one study that went over drinking alcohol and working and then peer influence, and it looked like adolescents that were more stressed at work, which working in a menial job and then also having stresses of work and school would amount to more stress, are more influenced to drink, which is also detrimental. Also, dropping out among adolescents that work is higher than those that don't. Um, Perhaps because the short term of having money now kind of negates the long term of kind of seeing a future oriented to college. Um, so, in the context of child labor, especially to the modern times, you see that the ability of an adolescent to work should be a right because some cases it's needed, especially if they have to help out themselves financially or their family. Um, but with the low percentage, it seems that most don't want to. Um, but I would see that if more jobs opened up that would help an adolescent in their future growth, such as paid internships or something that stimulated them intellectually, that would be more beneficial than just kind of the menial labor of most jobs that they can get, because there are few and most employers don't actually look for them. So I would say in that context, it goes into a larger sort of ill of society that hinders those in poverty, that they have to work, and then it puts them into this cycle of work over school, which then fosters not finishing school or not going to college and just keep working at minimum wage jobs, mostly because they have to. And then that's also hard to see. But it does, with the FLSA, it does show that countries taking some steps to allowing educational growth of adolescents and trying to keep their hours down to make education a priority, and then also protecting them from harmful situations just in general. Um, so, in conclusion, you see the history of work and then child labor also trying to help adolescents, and then at the same time trying to put education as a priority, although that doesn't really jive with the capitalist sort of society because it wants to keep them in the system. So it's kind of just more of a other social ill. But as far as the child labor goes, it did take some time to put children first and then give them a, I guess, voice and protection. And then that's also very positive, and it's a positive step forward with the FLSA trying to help more adolescents find jobs, even though those jobs might not be beneficial to them. But at the same time, if they can manage the stress of school and jobs and manage their money and responsibility, that also is very positive on their personal growth. All right, thank you.